Okay, this week's Parashas BeHar, talks about the mitzvah of Shemitah, the mitzvah of leaving the land fallow every 7 years. And there are many important issues that relate to this mitzvah. In a general sense, the purpose of the mitzvah is to serve as a reminder that the world belongs to God. It's God's world. And therefore it's His prerogative to tell us how we can and cannot use that world. So here we have land. Land was designed to be cultivated, and God tells us, no, let it sit for a year. So that's God asserting His prerogative. It's His world. He has the right to tell us how to use it, how not to use it. Now, the fact that it's God's world is a consequence of the fact that He created it. And that's why the number 7, of course, corresponds to the weekly Shabbos. As we work for 6 days and rest on the 7th day, as a testimony to the fact that God created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th. So as well, when it comes to years, we work the land for 6 years and we rest on the 7th year, which also alludes to the cycle of creation, that God created the world, therefore it's His world, and therefore we have to follow His instructions. And this is a very important theme in Jewish life generally, because we're not farmers. There's another very important halacha that relates to this, that Jews recite blessings before they eat. Before they have any pleasure from this world, we recite blessings. Also, a person cannot derive pleasure from this world before reciting the blessing. Now the Gemara in Maseches Brachos, discussing this rule of reciting blessings, poses a contradiction in verses. One verse says, Vashem ha'aretz u'moloa, to God belongs the earth and all that is contained therein. It's one verse. It's God's world. Another verse says, Hashemayim shemayim l'Hashem, the heaven is God's, v'ha'aretz nasan l'vnei adam, but the earth He gave to man. So what is it? Is it God's or is it man's? So the Gemara says, lo kasha, no contradiction. Kan kaidem bracha, kan lachar bracha. Before you recite the blessing, it's God's. After you recite the blessing, it's yours. Meaning, God lets us use the world. He gives it to us freely. On one condition, that we acknowledge that it's His world. So the blessing is that acknowledgement. You recite the blessing, then it becomes yours to enjoy. And that really is the lesson of Shemitah, that it's God's world. And the way we drive that point home is by following God's instruction not to use the world when He tells us not to. Okay, that's the general theme of Shemitah overall. But there is a secondary theme in the Parasha of Shemitah, which is this, that this mitzvah is a very difficult mitzvah to do. Because imagine a agricultural society where everyone is dependent for their livelihood on the production of the field, and all of a sudden God says, 1 year in 7, you have to take off. No work. Well, no work, no income. How are you meant to live? Forget the question, how are you meant to live? How are you meant to survive? I mean, if you're not planting, what are you going to eat? So it's very interesting. The Torah tells us a very interesting thing on this subject in the Parasha of Shemitah. I'll read you the verses. This is in chapter 25, verse 20. V'chisomru, and if you shall say, Man lechal b'shana hashviyas, what are we going to eat in the 7th year? Hein lo nizra lo nasa v'tzvosenu. We are not going to plant, and we are not going to harvest. So what are we meant to eat? So God says, I will command the blessing on the 6th year, and it will last for 3 years. It will last for the remainder of the 6th, it will last for the entire 7th, and it will last for the 8th until you harvest the grain of the 8th. So this is if you ask. And if you don't ask, then what happens? It almost seems that the faithless profit. Because if you ask the question, then God says, don't worry, I'll supply the blessing. If you don't ask, then there's no blessing. So we're penalizing the faithful. The people who don't question God won't get the blessing.
It doesn't say that.
It says, if you ask, so God says, then I will command the blessing. And if you don't ask, I won't command the blessing. What does it mean? So let me share with you two interpretations. The famous Hasidic work, Nayim Elimelech, brings from his brother, the famous Rebbe Reb Zisha. Someday we'll talk about the great brothers, the Rebbe Reb Melech and the Rebbe Reb Zisha. But he brings from his brother, the Rebbe Reb Zisha, a very important thing. He says like this. He says that there is a bounty in the world that God provides without your having to ask for it. There is a bounty that God provides without your having to ask for it. But that bounty is only extended to people that are faithful, people that possess bitachon, who place their trust in God. If you lack faith, then that bounty is not made available to you. So therefore, the verse means as follows. If you don't ask, because you are filled, you're saturated with faith in God, there'll be no need for God to issue a special command that the land should provide for you. Because that's built into the system. There is a bounty, there is a shefa, there is an abundance for those who possess faith. But if you lack faith, and you ask the question, God says, I will make sure you'll get it. That, of course, will necessitate a special command. I will command the blessing. But if you have faith, God won't even have to supply the blessing, because it will come naturally. Okay, this pshat is a little... If we have a better pshat, I think we would opt for a better pshat. The Sfornos is a very simple, very beautiful pshat over here. When we talk about blessing, there are two types of blessing. There is a qualitative blessing, and there's a quantitative blessing. Now let me translate this in modern terms. Let's say, for example, you are making X $1,000 a year, and you don't seem to be making it. Month after month, you're falling further and further behind. Every month there's an unexpected expense. Your car's transmission breaks down, the roof needs repairs, your kids get speeding tickets that you have to pay for. Every month something comes up, and it's just somehow you don't have enough money to end the month. So God sends you a blessing. So there are two possibilities. One possibility is a quantitative blessing. God sends you a raise, an increase in income. So now these extra expenses are covered. Well, that's obvious. If you were making $10,000 a month, now you're making $15,000 a month, then there's more money. But there's something else that can happen. Let's say, for example, no raise. You're making the same amount of money. Well, all of a sudden, all these unusual expenses don't come up. The kids aren't getting tickets, the roof isn't leaking, the transmission is operating, and without realizing it, you're doing better. You're doing better. In a sense, it's hidden. You know, your paycheck isn't any larger, but somehow it's lasting longer, because the unusual expenses aren't kicking in. That's also a blessing. Maybe it's even a bigger blessing, because of course extra income just means extra taxes, right? If you have the same income, just you have fewer expenses, that's really money in your pocket. So there are two possibilities. There's a quantitative blessing, there's more money coming in. There's a qualitative blessing, that the money lasts longer. Now, there's one difference, however, that works the other way. It says when you get more money, right? You take your paycheck out and you see that this month there's an extra zero at the end. You feel confident. If your paycheck is the same, you have no way of knowing that in the coming month you're not going to have those extra expenses. So the Sfarim says like this. So of course God provides during Shemitah. There's no doubt about it. If God gives a mitzvah that the land has to be fallowed for a year, certainly God has provided. How has He provided? He would have provided in ways that are not apparent. Not that there'll be a special abundance, but that somehow it will last longer. Perhaps it'll be more filling, more satisfying. Perhaps you won't have unusual extra expenses that will deplete your income. God will take care of you. If you lack faith and you ask the question, then God says, well, then I have to provide for you in a visible way, in a way which is apparent. Then it's vitzivisius birchasi. Then I'll command the blessing in the 6th year. There should be such an abundance that you'll go into Shemitah with confidence, because you see, I see there's so much more. Bumper crap. So certainly I'll be able to manage during Shemitah. If you had more faith, it wouldn't be this way. It would be in a manner that is not readily apparent. And in addition to the reward of observing Shemitah, you'd have the reward for having faith. This way, it's easy. In other words, if you have a crop Erev Shemitah, on the eve of Shemitah, which is twice as abundant, 3 times as abundant as normal, then it's a no-brainer. What's the trick of keeping Shemitah? Right? So if a person has faith, God will provide for him in a hidden way. If you lack faith, then God says, I will provide for you in a revealed way. But in any case, faith is a very, very central theme to Shemitah. The faith is a very, very complicated thing. Bitachon, trust in God. And I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about what it may be, what it may not be, and how we bring bitachon into our lives as a positive value. The Chazon Ish wrote a sefer, a little sefer called Emunah and Bitachon, Belief and Trust. And this is a very appropriate title, because these really are two different things. Sometimes we mistakenly use them interchangeably, but they're really two different things. Emunah means the set of propositions we believe to be true relating to God. Because we believe that God exists, we believe that God is one, we believe that God gave us the Torah, we believe that God is aware of the actions of mankind. There are certain truths we believe about God. That's emunah. That's emunah. It's belief. Without getting into the issue, is it belief or is it knowledge? This is a tough issue. How to precisely translate emunah. Does emunah mean belief? Does it mean knowledge? What is the difference between belief and knowledge, by the way? The difference between belief and knowledge is justification. There are things I believe, I have an inkling, I have a conviction that they may be so. I don't have evidence for it. I don't have proof for it. Knowledge means not only do I believe it to be true, but I have justification for believing that it's true. Well, what are we meant to do when it comes to God? Are we meant to believe in God, or are we meant to know God? I think the Rambam is quite clear in several places that we are meant to know God. It's not enough to believe in God. Why do you believe? What's the basis of your belief? We're meant to know that God exists. How can we know God exists? So there are several ways. One way is through philosophical speculation. There have been attempts throughout history to prove the existence of a supreme being. So perhaps that's our obligation. Even those who disagree with the Rambam and say that the philosophical speculation is not the ideal, and they rather say that the basis of our belief should be the chain of tradition, that doesn't mean belief without justification. It's a different type of justification. In other words, we believe that God exists, we know that God exists, and we have a good reason to believe it, because we have a chain of tradition relying on very, very reasonable, reliable people who had a direct experience with God, Nevi'im, etc. the Jews who stood at Har Sinai. They transmitted this information in an unbroken chain. So therefore we have a different type of justification. Not a justification because I've proven it independently. Justification because I believe the people that have passed it down are people that are worth relying upon. But in any case, that's emunah. There are many things we know to be true, and yet they do not become principles for living. For example, many people know that the key to a good job is education, and yet they still goof off in school. Why is that? I mean, they know that this is their future. Because again, there are things that we know to be true, and yet we don't act upon it. We don't live up to the truth. Bitachon, which is trust in God, is the practical application of emunah. It's living up to the truth of our convictions about God. If I believe all these things about God, that yes, that He exists, and that He's omnipotent and omniscient and perfectly virtuous, and He loves us, etc., that should translate itself into our way of living. That's what bitachon is. Bitachon, trust in God, is the practical application of emunah to life. So emunah is theoretical and abstract. Bitachon is practical and concrete. Now, what does it mean exactly, bitachon? What does it mean to trust in God, to rely on God? Many people think it believes the following, that whenever you are at a juncture, whenever you're at a crossroads, it is an obligation to believe that everything will work out the way I would like it to be. Many people believe that. And the Chazon Ish points out that that would be a very strange thing to believe in. Because so often in life, it doesn't work out that way. Nobody lives forever. And when a person, when a loved one passes on, it's always a disappointment. Whether it's a parent, a friend. And before the person dies, we prayed and we hoped and maybe we expressed our confidence that the person would get better, and it didn't happen. So it can't be that it's such an obligation, because it's counterintuitive. It doesn't make any sense. I mean, are we meant to believe such a thing? that things will work out the way we would want. Chazon Ish says that's not the case. The obligation of bitachon, trust in God, is really a constellation of ideas. But it is not the conviction that things will turn out the way we would like. Number one, it is the conviction that there is no inevitability to their turning out in the way that we would not like. It is the rejection of fatalism. You know, many people hear bad news and they despair. They give up. There's no use. There's no hope. The Baal Bitachon understands that we're living in God's world. God is omnipotent. God is omniscient. He is aware of the problem. He certainly can solve the problem if He wishes to. There is no inevitability to it turning out badly. And therefore, there is always room for hope. There's always room for meaningful hishtadlus, meaningful effort to rectify the situation. There's always room for prayer. There's always room for accruing merit, which can perhaps cancel the evil decree. So, for example, you go to the hospital and you visit someone who's undergoing tests, and he receives a prognosis which at first glance seems bleak. So the obligation of bitachon is not to believe with a certainty that he will get better. You know, to believe such a thing is outlandish. But one must believe there is no inevitability to that person's death. There is no inevitability to that person's death, and therefore we have to still work and try and be mishtadel, as the Hebrew goes, and exert effort, both in the practical sense of getting doctors and administering therapies, in the spiritual sense of praying, saying Tehillim, giving tzedakah, and so on and so forth. There's no inevitability to the evil. And therefore, one aspect of bitachon is hope. Hope. Not to despair, not to give up. That a person should always maintain hope, because there is no inevitability to things turning out badly. Number two, the second aspect of bitachon is the understanding that whatever happens is good. Which is not the same thing as saying whatever happens will be pleasant. But everything that happens will be good. What does good mean? Good means it is in conformity with God's will. Now, let's say a person needs a kapara. He requires atonement. Let's say he's committed a sin, which requires an atonement. And he receives a punishment that involves suffering. Is that pleasant? No, it's not pleasant. Suffering is never pleasant. Is it good? Sure, it's good. It's a good thing to have your sins atoned for in this world so that you can go on to the next world and enjoy undiluted bliss. It would have been much better had you not committed the sin. Because then you could have had a life that was not only good but pleasant too. So all things being equal, good and pleasant is better than good and unpleasant. But bitachon means that we believe with a conviction that everything that happens is good. Now, how does that make our lives better? If we know that it's going to be good but possibly unpleasant, why does that enhance the quality of our lives? Well, the answer is really this, that it gives us a certain measure of serenity and peace of mind. In other words, that what's going to happen is not going to be bad, it's going to be good. It may not be as I would have wanted, but it's good. And people are actually quite resilient. People are able to bear pain, suffering. It's the meaninglessness of it which we have a hard time coping with. So if a person understands that God runs the world and everything is good, it may be that it's not as pleasant as I would like, but it's good. That gives me the ability to accept it with serenity, peace of mind, and that alone will greatly improve the quality of one's life. And you see among the great tzaddikim, when they leave this world, it's with a tremendous menuchas nefesh, tremendous serenity. But if you read accounts of the depths of great tzaddikim, you see that this is the one thing which characterizes it: tremendous, tremendous peace, tremendous acceptance, tremendous, perhaps even joy. I mean, the classic example of this, of course, is the Zohar, which tells the story of the passing of Shimon Bar Yochai. And that day was a very important day, because the Zohar tells us that on the day of a person's passing, this is when he receives his greatest enlightenment. And therefore the greatest secrets, the greatest mysteries that Shimon Bar Yochai revealed in the Zohar, he revealed on the day of his death. And he told his followers that this day will be a day of celebration for all time. Because this is the day in which he left his greatest legacy for the world. But to leave a world like that is an amazing, amazing thing. That type of peace of mind. And that really is the idea of bitachon. One way you can bring it out is with a little thought, which I think is so magnificent. There's a Gemara in Masechtas Brachos, which brings the pasuk Mishmua Ra'ah Lo Yira, that a tzaddik is not scared of bad news. Nachon libo b'tuach b'Hashem, because his heart is confident, is trusting in God. That's the verse says. So the Gemara says, what's the illustration of this? The illustration of this was Hillel. Hillel was once traveling, the great sage Hillel, and he comes home, and he hears screams from the city. And he says, I know that it's not coming from my house. I know it's not coming from my house. And sure enough, he came home, and it wasn't from his house, it was from somewhere else. So the question is, how did he know that? I mean, bitachon, trust, means, again, a conviction that everything is going to be as I would like it, that if there's trouble, it's not in my house. What does it mean? So the Aruch HaShulchan says an amazing pshat. It's an amazing pshat. Hillel wasn't saying that there will never be misfortune in my house. But they were screaming. They were saying, that is not from my house. If there was a misfortune in my house, there wouldn't be screaming. there would be acceptance, there would be serenity, peace of mind. If I hear screams already, I know it's not my house. Because Mishmur Ra Lo Yira, what Hillel taught in his household is not to be scared of bad news. Not to be scared of bad news. And I remember reading in the article, biography of Rav Pam Zecher Tzadik Livracha. Rav Pam lived a long life, but even if you lived into your 90s, no one is excited about the prospect of leaving. And again, there were medical issues, and there were tests, and they're waiting for the reports to come back. And he was in his house, in his study, sitting and learning. And one of his children walks into the room, and he looks up, as if to ask, "Is there any news?" And the son tells him that there's news. It's cancer. It's malignant. And the father nodded his head. Okay, goes back to learning. In other words, it was as if he had received this report about somebody else. Okay, he was curious. He needed to know. He wanted to know. He got the message. All right. Back to the Gemara. In other words, who wouldn't want to leave the world like that? We're not in a state of panic, in a state of menuchas nefesh, serenity. It's an amazing thing. One of the corollaries of this is that a person who possesses bitachon will not grab at straws. He will be mishtadel, he will exert effort to better his situation, but he won't do things that aren't reasonable. Because once there is nothing reasonable left to do, then at that point he's in God's hands. So let me tell you something that I know personally. I lived for a number of years in San Diego, California. San Diego is right across the border from Tijuana, Mexico. And Tijuana is renowned for various medical clinics that I guess we would say are essentially quackery. And a lot of people would go to these clinics after medical science has given up. In other words, they went through the conventional treatments and so on and so forth, and the doctor said, "There's nothing more we can do." And their attitude was, "Well, I can't sit and do nothing, got to do something." So they would travel to Tijuana. And I became aware of this because it was very interesting. The Chevra Kadisha, the burial society in San Diego, often had to deal with people who passed on in Tijuana. They traveled there out of desperation, and they tried these treatments, and of course, had they only come a week earlier, they would have been saved, and it was too late. And many people died in Tijuana, and ultimately had to be shipped back to other places, New York, other places, to be buried. And it always struck me as being an odd thing. As grabbing at straws. Because you know that these things don't work. Everyone knows these things don't work. But what's the idea? The idea is, I should do nothing? I should do nothing? I think the answer really is yes. I know it's hard to take. But the answer is that beyond a certain point, the attitude has to be that as long as there's something reasonable, something that makes sense, then the person has to be mishtadel, the person has to be hopeful. Once you reach the point that there's nothing sensible to do, then just to grasp at straws is a mistake. At that point, the person has to place himself totally in God's hands. Now, to say that I'm confident that I will live up to this, I don't want to say. I don't want to say that, listen, follow my sterling example, you'll see. Maybe that when my time comes, I'll also go to Tijuana. I hope not. I hope that the things that I believe in the theoretical sense, I will apply in the practical sense when the time comes. But there's a famous story which is also related to the idea of bitachon. The Gemara says that a person has to bless God when bad things happen the same way he blesses God when good things happen. The Gemara says, what does that mean in what sense? They have to accept suffering, they have to accept it lovingly. So there was a great going, the Beis Ephraim, big Talmud Chacham, big Torah scholar, wrote many important Sfarim, and he was a wealthy man. He owned a ship. And one day, word came that the ship sank. He lost his entire fortune. And his students had to break the news to him. So how are they going to tell him he lost his entire fortune? I said, Rebbe, he says, what is the meaning of the Gemara? The Gemara says you have to bless God for bad things, the same way you bless God for good things. What is the meaning of the Gemara? So it says it means you have to accept it, b'simcha, accept it with joy. So that Rebbe, explain to us exactly what it means. So the Rebbe said it means that when misfortune occurs, midarf tanzen, you have to dance with joy. So he said, Eva Zoy Rebbe, if so, tanz, start dancing. Your ship sank and you're bankrupt. So at that point he fainted. So when he came to, he said, I thought I knew the meaning of the Gemara, but now I say I don't really know the meaning of the Gemara. No, he knew the meaning of the Gemara, but it's one thing to know the meaning of the Gemara, the other thing is to make it a principle by which you live. It's a lot harder. If the story happened, the story may be apocryphal, but the point is very hard. So I'm not saying that, just follow me. When my time comes, you're going to see I'm going to do it right. I wish it would be the case. But the point is that we have to understand, if you don't think about these things in advance, when the time comes, you'll certainly panic. In other words, a person has to go through life thinking about matters of faith, matters of trust. Now, the source of this idea is an amazing thing. The Chazon Ish writes about this, and he brings an amazing source to this idea. There's the famous story of Yosef. Now, Yosef is in prison, and he's together with the Sarah Ophim, the Sarah Mashkim, the chief wine steward, the chief baker, and they have dreams, and they're very disturbed. They don't know the meaning of the dreams. Yosef interprets the dreams that the wine steward will be given his job back, and the baker will be hanged. And Yosef tells the wine steward that whereas you are going to be saved, put in a good word for me to Paro when you get your job back. Just remind Paro that there's a fellow in prison, he's a Jewish boy, he's a dream interpreter, he got it right, and Paro should have mercy. Well, sure enough, Yosef's interpretations come true. The Sarah Ophim is hanged, the Sarah Mashkim is restored to his job, and sure enough, just as you'd expect, the Sarah Mashkim forgets Yosef for 2 years, and he only remembers Yosef because Paro has a dream that requires interpretation, and the Sarah Mashkim says, oh, and now I remember there was a boy in prison who interprets dreams. And that's how Yosef ultimately was released and became viceroy of Egypt, and we know the rest of the story. The Medrash says that Yosef had to remain an extra 2 years in prison because of the sin of placing his trust in the Sarah Mashkim. Because he relied on the Sarah Mashkim 2 extra years in prison, because it was 2 years from the release of the Sarah Mashkim until Yosef was released. So everyone asks the question that this is a lack of faith. The obligation of faith doesn't preclude the possibility of trying. You have to try whatever you can try. So asking the Sarah Mashkim to put in a good word, that's a lack of faith. So the Chazon Ish says yes. Why? Just think about it for a second. Now you have this guy, he's been in prison for who knows how long. It's Paro's birthday, and his birthday, he likes to handle some of the backlogs. So some people he hangs, some people he pardons. So the Sarah Mashkim was pardoned. He got off by the skin of his teeth. So, he's lucky to be alive. He could have been hanged long to Sarah Ophim. So now he's been spared by the skin of his teeth. He's going to come to pardon. Oh, by the way, maybe you'd like to pardon someone else too. I mean, it's a harebrained scheme. But you think the Sarah Mashkim is really going to be effective in his advocacy of Yosef? Yosef was clutching at straws. That is inappropriate for a person of faith. If there's nothing that makes sense, if there's nothing that's reasonable, then you're in God's hand.
But in the end, it did help.
No. It wasn't because Yosef told him to put in a good word. It's because when there was a need for a dream interpreter, the Sun Apr remembered his dream was interpreted. But it wasn't Yosef's request that made a difference. Now, it's interesting to know, I'll tell you another story which illustrates this, I think, beautifully. I think I said it in this class. There was a great guy, he was called the Alter from Nevada. He established a chain of yeshivas, first in Russia. And then when the communists came to power, in a magnificent, daring way, he moved this network of 80 yeshivas from Russia to Poland to escape the communists. An amazing, amazing thing. And, these yeshivas were not like our modern yeshivas with buildings and endowments and fundraising. These people lived from hand to mouth and with tremendous sacrifice and tremendous mesiras nefesh, they spread Torah. So there was one time that the Alter from Nevada himself, the head of this entire network, had to raise money for the central yeshiva. So he took a student with him, and they decided to go to visit a certain wealthy individual who lived in a distant city. So they took the train to the city, and when they got there, they discovered that it was several kilometers from the train station to this person's home. So the Alter of Nevada told the student, we have to walk. He says, we can't afford to take a cab. The yeshiva has no money. We have to minimize our expenses. So if we can walk, we can't pay for a carriage. So they walked to this person's house, and they made their pitch, and the person turned them away. Nothing, not a penny. The whole trip was a waste. So the Alter of Nevada, as they left the house, he hailed a carriage. You have to go back to the train station. So the Talmud says, I don't understand. He said, on the way here, when we had hopes of making money, he said we couldn't afford it. He says, now we know that we failed, we've made nothing, and now you're willing to spend the money for the carriage. So Alter Nevada said like this, until now, we were relying on flesh and blood. We were relying on people. We put our faith in people. And there are limits to what people can do. There's only so much money they have, only so much money they can give. So we have to conserve. But now we know that we failed, so we have to place our trust only in God. God, no limit to what He can provide. We can afford the carriage. And that's the idea of the bitachon. But its hallmark is that serenity, that peace of mind, that lack of panic. And that itself is its own reward. The reward of bitachon is not that things turn out as I would want. Even Bali bitachon die, and Bali bitachon are poor, and Bali bitachon suffer. The reward of bitachon is the attitude which you live with, the attitude of hope on the one hand, and acceptance on the other hand, which makes life so much more pleasant, so much more bearable. That's what bitachon is. Again, hope, because there is no inevitability to things turning badly, and acceptance, because I know that everything is good. It may not be pleasant, but it's good, it advances the divine purpose, and therefore I accept it. That attitude of hope and acceptance gives a person the serenity, the menuchas nefesh, the peace of mind, to live a life and be happy. So even at the end, as he faces his own death, he can look back with satisfaction and not with a sense of confusion or panic. That's bitachon. And the bitachon is a central theme of Shemitah. Right? It's not easy to watch your field being fallow. It requires faith. The truth is, to be a Jew generally requires faith. And there's a very interesting thing I'd like to share with you that I saw in several svarim. The Torah makes a point that the mitzvah of Shemitah was given BeHar Sinai. The parsha is called BeHar. Vaydaber Hashem Moshe BeHar Sinai Lemor. This mitzvah was given on Har Sinai. Now all the mitzvahs are given on Sinai. So why does the Torah make a point of these mitzvahs being given on Sinai? And Rashi poses the question with a famous expression, Ma inyan Shemitah etzel Har Sinai. What is the connection of Shemitah to Har Sinai? And this phrase of Rashi has become an idiom in Hebrew language. In other words, if I would come to a program here in Thornhill, and I would run into someone who I know from New York, and I would express my wonder, like, what is he doing here? I might say, Ma inyan Shemitah etzel Har Sinai. What's the connection of Shemitah and Har Sinai? I mean, what are you doing here? You're from New York. What are you doing here in Thornhill? It's become a popular expression. I think not only among religious people, but anybody who's learned a little Chumash knows this expression, Ma inyan Shemitah etzel Har Sinai. So the Rashi makes the point. It comes to teach me that all the mitzvahs resemble Shemitah in one sense. Shemitah, all its laws were given in Har Sinai, not just the general principles, even the details. By analogy, all the mitzvahs as well were given in their general principles and in their specifics at Sinai. Now the question is, but still, why does the Torah derive this from Shemitah? The Torah could have picked any other mitzvah, tell us that its details and generalities were given at Sinai, and by analogy we would compare the entire Torah to that mitzvah. Still, why Shemitah? Now it's a very interesting thing. There is a medrash, really two midrashim, that interpret a verse. There's a verse in Tehillim which says like this: Baruch Hu Hashem Malachav, that God's angels should bless Him. What is special about the angels? O say dvaro, they do God's word. Lishmaya b'kol dvaro, and they heed His voice. So we have an interesting thing here. We have these angels described as beings who do God's bidding, and they heed His voice, which is a reversal, because normally you would expect to say that the person first listened and then did, not that he did and then listened. So what is this reminiscent of? So it's reminiscent of the Jews who stood at Har Sinai, who said, Nasa v'nishma. First they committed themselves to do, and they said, then we'll listen. But we're committing ourselves to action first. So the Gemara says that these angels we're talking about really are angels who are very similar to the Jews. In fact, the Gemara says that when the Jews said the magic formula of Nasa v'nishma, HaKadosh Baruch Hu's response was, Mi huzesh, mi gila rozel lebana, who revealed the secret? This is Lashon Shemalach Yesharis Mashtam Shembo. This is the way the angels act. The angels first act and then listen. So the Jews, in doing that, they were emulating the angels. That medrash everyone knows. But the Gemara brings another medrash on the same pasuk. Who are these angels? Elu Shomrei Shvius. These are the people that observe Shemitah. These are the people that observe Shemitah. The same pasuk, which the Medrash in one place applies to the Jews who stood at Har Sinai and said Nasa v'nishma, the Medrash applies to the Shomrei Shemitah, the people who observe Shemitah. So now you can't ask anymore what's the connection of Shemitah to Har Sinai. The Medrash apparently says that they're totally related. The answer is very, very simple. We think about Nasa v'nishma. Jews come and they commit themselves to action even before they hear what God has asked of them. What does that mean? What is the significance of such a reversal? And there are many, many interpretations. But the simplest interpretation is that it is an expression of faith and trust in God. In other words, God says here, I have a Torah to offer you. I want you to live by it. So the natural inclination would be to ask, well, tell me about it. What does it say there? The Jews didn't do that. The Jews said, no question, we accept it without reservation. Now, please tell us what it said. So Nasa v'nishma is first and foremost an expression of faith. Now the Gemara says that the great sage Rava was once learning, and a heretic came to him, and he says, Amo Peziza, you're an impulsive nation. You put your mouths before your ears. Meaning you said, we will do, before you heard what God said. So Rava answered, no, you don't understand. The verse says, regarding the Jewish people, Tumas Yesharim Tanchem, that the trust of the upright gives them rest. In other words, upright, good people trust in God, and this gives them a serenity. So it's not amazing that we accepted the Torah, we relied on God, and we trusted Him. Shemitah, as we said also, is a mitzvah you can't observe without tremendous trust. Because again, you're planning on leaving your land fallow. How do you know you'll have the essentials, food to eat? It's a function of trust, a function of faith. So therefore the two are related. Our acceptance of Torah as Jews is predicated on faith. The observance of Shemitah specifically is predicated on faith, perhaps more than any other mitzvah. And therefore, that's the connection of Shemitah and Darchei. That's why the two are related. And this is something that I think we need to focus on. This is the type of thing that in our lives we need a little more of. And the question is, exactly what does that mean? What is the one thing that we have to work on? I'm not advocating that anybody should give up his job or anybody should stop working and rely on faith. I don't think that faith necessitates that. I think that we're obligated to have jobs and work and earn a living and so on and so forth. But I think there's one thing that we have to be mindful of. That there are a lot of people who think that if I live in accordance with God's demands, I cannot survive. Now, this was a big challenge when the first immigrants came to America, I believe before the Second World War. And at that time, the norm in America was a 6-day work week. People worked on Saturday too. And you had shuls that had early minyanim, early services on Shabbos morning that were packed. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people came to pray at these early services so that on Shabbos they could go to work after attending synagogue. And this was a commonplace in America. What really saved Shabbos in America was the shift to the 5-day week. Once you have the 5-day work week, so you can take off Saturday anyway, and you have Sunday too. So, it becomes less of a challenge. But when the 6-day work week was the norm, Sunday was a day off, Saturday was a work day, it was a tremendous, tremendous challenge. It says we have to know that if we do what God wants of us, we can rely on God providing for us. Because we don't have to be mishtadel in such a way which undermines our ability to live up to that which God asks of us. There are people who think that I'm going to go to shul every day. I can't go to shul every day to daven. I'm too busy. If I don't open my business at 6 o'clock in the morning, I don't keep it open until 10 o'clock at night, I'm not going to have a livelihood. What does that mean? It means no prayer, no Torah study, no spending time with my children, no spending time with my wife, no participation in the communal affairs, and so on and so forth. First, that's a mistake. That's a mistake. Yeah, a person has to have a job. But the same Lord who provides you with a livelihood if you work a 14-hour day can provide you with the same livelihood if you work a 8-hour day, leaving you time for all these other things. Right? That we have to know. What does God want of us? And know that doing what God wants is not going to jeopardize our livelihood. It's not going to jeopardize our survival. Shemitah is an extreme example of that. Right? Shemitah, we're told not just to knock it off an hour early, take off a year. Right? Yet Hashem says, don't worry, I'll provide. We have to know the same thing, that when we make career choices, life choices, right? We can't delude ourselves into thinking that we're going to have success if only we forego what God wants of us. That's a mistake. Right? That is not going to work. And to the contrary, we have to do what God wants of us with a confidence. If God asks us to do this, then undoubtedly He'll give us the means to be able to realize that choice. So this is the lesson of Bitachon, a very important lesson, and hopefully we'll be able to introduce this into our lives. Question?
I had learned that there was always this enormous bumper crop in the sixth year, but it wasn't always so.
No, that's what the Mepharshim seems to say, that God makes a concession for people to lack faith. You lack faith? Okay, I'll give it to you. However you understand it, like the two interpretations we gave. But if you have faith, then it will not be apparent at all. It will make a difference. It won't have to be apparent if you have faith. If you have faith, you'll manage.
So they did
and you'll manage in ways that are inexplicable.
So if they did an objective count of the country's crops, it wouldn't necessarily have
that's right.
objectively showed that there was...
That's right. In other words, that's why it's an amazing thing that, there are publications that like to collect amazing Shemitah stories. They say in this farm there was 50% extra, 100% extra, 300% extra, and so on and so forth. That's not a good sign. That's a sign of faithlessness, that God had to make it apparent.
Does that imply that there's an issue of Ein Hara that wouldn't exist to a person who has
Yeah, well, again, a visible abundance always opens to the Ein Hara. There can be jealousy, right? Whereas if it's hidden, it isn't that way. Right? No one's going to be jealous of the fact that you didn't get a flat tire this month. No one will know that that was God protecting you to increase your livelihood. But a visible abundance does open you, make you susceptible to over jealousy, and that's what the basis of Ayin Hara. Okay, everyone, thank you very much. Bez Hashem, next week.